All right, so I'm going to finish up with the last about 4 pages of this chapter. Just try to do it all in one shot since there's not a whole lot of new stuff or really difficult stuff. Dewey is basically continuing what he talked about last time with this disintegrative influence of science on common sense. So we're going to deal with that topic mostly in the last part of this last few pages of this chapter, and of course take a little preview of the following chapter. So let's get started with this. So Dewey writes, 2 aspects of the disintegration which creates the semblance of complete opposition and conflict will be noted. So he's talking about the conflict, the apparent conflict between common sense and science. We call this a semblance of complete opposition. As we've seen, there's not really a complete opposition between science and common sense. They deal with different things, but they're not opposed to each other. They're not in conflict, in necessary conflict with each other, although they can seem to be in conflict, as we'll see. So the aspects of this is the fact already noted that common sense is concerned with a field that is dominantly qualitative, right? It deals with the qualitative world, with what we can qualitatively experience, while science is compelled by its own problems and goals to state the subject matter in terms of magnitude and other mathematical relations which are non-qualitative. So we sometimes kind of oppose or distinguish the qualitative and the quantitative and say that science deals with quantitative. That's a bit of a simplification, but that gets us into the right direction for the time being. Common sense is concerned with the qualitative world, and science is concerned more or less with what can be quantitatively known. The other fact, so the other aspect of this apparent opposition, this disintegration, this disintegrative influence of science, is that since common sense is concerned directly and indirectly with problems of use and enjoyment, it is inherently teleological. Teleological, I believe we've seen this word before, I'm not sure, but end-oriented, right? Goal-oriented, going towards a goal, purposeful, things like that would be teleological, and that applies to common sense. The common sense world, we're concerned about the goals, our goals, we're concerned with the purposes of things. Science, on the other hand, has progressed by elimination of final causes from every domain with which it is concerned, substituting measured correspondences of change. Final cause, that's an idea going back to Aristotle, and we'll be looking at Aristotelian logic more in the next chapter. Final causes, these are teleological things. The idea that the purpose of something causes it to be used in a particular way. Our goals, our purposes cause us to act in a certain way to go towards those goals. It's kind of the idea of being drawn toward a goal, which is has been a difficult idea to understand scientifically because, of course, the goal doesn't exist yet in a material way in the same way that, the furniture around you, the walls around you exist, right? But it still seems to have some kind of causal efficacy. It still seems to have an effect on the world. And there's been a problem for scientific theory. But where am I? Let's see. The other fact. Oh, yeah. And so he mentions correspondences of change. So not looking at final causes, but as correlating changes with each other. As he's going to say, efficient causation. So science operates, to use the old terminology, in terms of efficient causation. This is the more familiar kind of billiard ball. Sometimes people say billiard ball style causation, where one thing bumps into another thing and that causes the effect, right? So the force of one thing on another thing is a kind of efficient causation. This is easier to understand scientifically. So efficient causation irrespective of ends and values. Ends and values, of course, being things that are more familiar in the common sense world and a little bit hard to deal with in science, or it's not been historically easy to figure out how to deal with ends and values in scientific logic. Upon the basis of the position here taken, these differences are due to the fact that different types of problems demand different modes of inquiry for their solution, not to any ultimate division in existential subject matter. Right? So Dewey's pragmatic view is that common sense and science deal with different kinds of problems. There's not like a fundamental difference there, but trying to accomplish different things can require different kinds of methods, right? Different modes of inquiry. The subject matter of science is stated in symbol constellations. Symbol constellations, so you can think of that as the technical terms of science that we use, mathematical symbols and things like that. So science, the subject matter of science, is stated in symbol constellations that are radically unlike those familiar to common sense, where we tend to use ordinary speech to state things in what, in effect, is a different language, right? So scientific language is almost like a totally different thing. You have to learn it. Generally, after you learn the common sense language, the language of the common sense world, when you take on specialized scientific inquiries, you have to learn the language of those specialized scientific inquiries. Moreover, there is much highly technical material that has not been incorporated into common sense, even by way of technological application in material affairs. So a lot that has been done in the fields of technology and in special scientific inquiries has not found its way into common sense, even through like the new technologies and so on. In the region of highest importance to common sense, namely that of moral, political, economic ideas and beliefs, and the methods of forming and confirming them, science has had even less effect. So science has not had much effect on ethics, on politics, maybe a little more these days on economics, but not much in Dewey's time on economics. So a lot of really important areas are not that touched by science, or we even try to keep science out of those areas. Conceptions and methods in the field of human relationships are in much the same state as were the beliefs and methods of common sense in relation to physical nature before the rise of experimental science. So again, science has not had a big impact. Even today, like the methods of science have not had a huge impact on the field of human relationships. These considerations fix the meaning of the statement that the difference that now exists between common sense and science is a social rather than a logical matter. So the opposition of common sense and science is social, not logical. I can't talk. If the word language is used not just formally, but to include its contents and substantial meanings, the difference is a difference of languages. So again, the language of common sense and the language of science are quite different, and it takes a lot of study, a lot of acculturation to learn how to use scientific language. The problem, but this doesn't mean that there's, again, a necessary opposition between science and common sense. It's just they're trying to do different things, deal with different kinds of problems. The problems of science demand a set of data and a system of meanings and symbols so differentiated that science cannot rightly be called organized common sense. Right? So science is not just organized common sense, but it is a potential organ for organizing common sense in its dealing with its own subject matter and problems. And this potentiality is far from actualization. So, yeah, an organ of organization. So science can potentially help us to organize common sense, even though science is not organized common sense per se, but we can use it to help us organize our common sense dealings with the common sense world, although in Dewey's time this was far from actualization, and it still seems, to be honest, far from actualization, far from actually happening. We're a long ways from kind of accepting the scientific method as legitimate in, dealing with ethical beliefs and dealing with spiritual beliefs and dealing with culture and art and things like that. In the techniques which affect human use of the materials of physical nature and production, science has become a powerful agency of organization. So science has had a big effect, for example, on industry, right? Even before, long before Dewey's time, in the rise of people like the names of the big industrialists are escaping me at the moment. I'm thinking of one particular, Rockefeller. There we go. The Rockefellers, for example. John D. Rockefeller made a great use of science, and then subsequently scientific methods were used to improve efficiency and all of that within industry and, of course, technology, blah, blah, blah. I think you know all those kinds of things. So science has had a big effect in some areas of human life, but not all areas, which is interesting. As far as issues of enjoyment, of consumption are concerned, it has had little effect. Science has had little effect on those things. Morals and the problems of social control are hardly touched. Of course, Skinner tried to apply scientific method to things like social control, behavioral control. And control is not really quite the right word here. He was not authoritarian, but he was trying to give us tools for more effectively managing our behavior. People didn't really like that. And also these tools were still not quite developed enough. They turned out to be not quite workable. People did try to use these tools. But yeah, I think a science of behavior is still a long way off, one that actually functions well. Aside from the fact that people just don't like the sound of it. Beliefs, conceptions, customs, and institutions whose rise antedated the modern period still have possession of the field. So we still kind of rely on these old, pre-scientific moral ideas, traditions, customs. The union of this fact with the highly technical and remote language of science creates and maintains the feeling and idea of a complete gap between science and common sense. The paths of communication between common sense and science are as yet largely one-way lanes. Science takes its departure from common sense, right? So it goes from common sense to science. Science begins with common sense, with the common sense world. But the return road into common sense is devious and blocked by existing social conditions. But it's hard for science to work its way back into common sense. And this is what Dewey thinks is the role of science, is to help us refine, help us organize better common sense, the common sense world, common sense beliefs, common sense goals and values. But the way of getting science back into common sense is devious. It's blocked. It's hard to get back into common sense from science. People are resistant to it, sometimes for good reasons, I think. And scientists have not always been good at explaining things to the common sense world, to their common sense brethren, their fellows, brothers and sisters. And so science and scientists have, I think, some part of the blame here. But yes, existing traditions, customs, institutions also are a problem, also are a roadblock. Continuing on. In the things of greatest import, there is little intercommunication. Intercommunication between science and common sense. Pre-scientific ideas and beliefs in morals and politics are, moreover, so deeply ingrained in tradition and habit and institutions that the impact of scientific method is feared as something profoundly hostile to mankind's dearest and deepest interests and values. I've kind of discussed this already, this point already, that the common sense world can be hostile to science, sometimes maybe with good reason. When you look at how dangerous some certain scientific advances and technologies have been, maybe there's sometimes good reason to be skeptical of the methods and outcomes of science. On the side of philosophical formulation, highly influential schools of thought are devoted to maintaining the domain of values, ideas, and ideals as something wholly apart from any possibility of application of scientific method. So there are these traditional schools of thought which are hostile to the application of science. Earlier philosophic conceptions of the necessary separation between reason and experience, theory and practice, higher and lower activities, are used to justify the necessity of division. This was talked about earlier in this chapter, the background of this division between reason and experience, theory, practice, kind of the higher, more pure kinds of philosophic thought, and the lower, more practical activities. So we've seen that before. With respect to the second point, that of a seeming fundamental difference due to the fact that common sense is profoundly teleological in its controlling ideas and methods, while science is deliberately indifferent to teleology, it must be noted that in spite of the theoretical difference physical science has, in practical fact, liberated and vastly extended the range of ends open to common sense and has enormously increased the range and power of the means available for attaining them. This sentence is too long, Dewey, but the point is that although we have this difference, we see this difference, this antithesis between common sense and science, right? Common sense is profoundly teleological in every which way, while science is, as he says, deliberately indifferent to teleology. So it tries to avoid final causes, thinking about ends, purposes, values. In spite of this difference, physical science has actually liberated, extended the range of ends that common sense can deal with, can foresee, can propose, right? We have all these new ends because of scientific advancements. We have new ends that arise through our abilities to travel greater distances than we could in the past, to communicate with each other across greater distances than we could in the past, and all of, many other things like that. So we have all these new ends that arise because of these new things and new ways of attaining those ends. In ancient thought, ends were fixed by nature. Departure from those ends that were antecedently set and fixed by the very nature of things was impossible. The attempt to institute ends of human devising was taken to be the sure road to confusion and chaos. So in the ancient world, ends were fixed by nature, by the order of things. If you wanted to mess with those, well, that was going to be a problem. That was chaos. Don't do it. In the moral field, this conception still exists and is even probably dominant. So we still have this idea, like, don't mess with our morals. Chaos will ensue. But in respect to material affairs, it has been completely abandoned. But we don't care, like, when it comes to, well, I shouldn't say we don't care. But we care less. Fewer people care, right, when it comes to what we do with the material world. This is, changing somewhat. Dewey lived before the specter of climate change and before other pollution-oriented problems. But, of course, we want scientific solutions to those problems, most of us. So that's, still the domain of material affairs, where we want kind of new ends and means given to us by science. Inventions, or at least made possible through science, not really given to us by science, but made possible, and we can take them up or not, or we can, come up with new ends because of what science makes possible. But in respect to, going on. Inventions of new agencies and instruments create new ends. They create new consequences, which stir men to form new purposes. Right? So new scientific developments have consequences, which lead us to devise new purposes. Going to Mars, altering the climate of the world that we have unintentionally altered. Things like that. The original philosophical meaning of ends as fixed completions is almost forgotten. Instead of science eliminating ends and inquiries controlled by teleological considerations, it has, on the contrary, enormously freed and expanded activity and thought in telic matters. So we've talked about this already. I don't think I need to say much more. Science has not eliminated the teleological, but given, expanded the teleological, the domain of the teleological. It expanded the kinds of purposes we can have and the means for attaining those purposes. This effect is not a matter of opinion, but of facts too obvious to be denied. Yeah, I mean, if you look at especially the history of the 20th century, what is it except the application of science to create, which has had the effect of creating new ends for us, allowed us to foresee new purposes, new ends, new values, and attain those in new ways. The same sort of thing holds of the qualities with which common sense is inextricably concerned. Multitudes of new qualities have been brought into existence by the application of physical science. And what is even more important, our power to bring qualities within actual experience when we so desire has been intensified almost beyond the possibility of estimate. Consider as one instance alone our powers with respect to qualities generated by light and electricity. Yeah, there's a really clear example of how science has changed common sense and the common sense world of qualities, right? What has had a bigger effect on qualitative experience than electricity, right? The ability to flip on a switch and have the world illuminated in a new way, to turn on your TV and see new kinds of qualities and hear new kinds of qualities, right? That's just one really, really obvious example, but there's like a gazillion other examples, bigger and smaller examples that you could think of. The foregoing survey is made for a double purpose. On the one hand, the outstanding problem of our civilization is set by the fact that common sense in its content, its world and methods, is a house divided against itself. So there's a kind of division within common sense. It consists in part, so common sense consists in part, and that part, the most vital, of regulative meanings and procedures that antedate the rise of experimental science in its conclusions and methods. Regulative meanings and procedures, so think about, morality, for example, or customary ways of doing things, conventions, right, that we hold over from pre-scientific days. In another part, common sense is what it is because of application of science. This cleavage marks every phase and aspect of modern life: religious, economic, political, legal, and even artistic. So there's a lot of common sense that is what it is because of the application of science. Like all those realms dealing with, maybe medicine, technologically mediated culture, travel, right? Think about travel. And, that's such a big part of our common sense world, travel and telecommunications. And that is what it is because of the application of science. And yet there are parts of that dealing with, politics, religion, law, art to some extent, that is based on ideas from before science. The existence of this split is put in evidence by those who condemn the modern world and who hold that the only solution of the chaos in civilization is to revert to the intellectual beliefs and methods that were authoritative in past ages, as well as by radicals and revolutionaries. So on the one hand, you have people who want to return to pre-scientific beliefs. You see this in many kinds of religious fundamentalism, probably all kinds of religious fundamentalism, although they rely on things like social media and smartphones nowadays. But of course, that can be a good example of what Dewey is talking about, this division within common sense, where on the one hand you have people who want to revert to like a pre-scientific thing, and then you want also people who want to overturn the whole system, these radicals, and create something new, not something pre-scientific, but something altogether new. And then they're both relying on kind of the tools given to us given to common sense by the application of science through, of course, capitalism. Between the two, between the reactionaries and the revolutionaries, stand the multitude that is confused and insecure, right? And then everyone else is kind of in the middle, like, well, what are we supposed to do? How do we deal with these two things? How do we update our beliefs update our beliefs and institutions and values without creating chaos? It is for this reason that it is here affirmed that the basic problem of present culture and associated living is that of affecting integration where division now exists. So integration rather than division. The problem cannot be solved apart from a unified logical method of attack and procedure. Unified logical method. The attainment of unified method means that the fundamental unity of the structure of inquiry in common sense and science be recognized, that their difference being one in the problems with which they are directly concerned, not in their respective logics. So we have to realize, and Dewey has said this many times by now, that common sense and science are not fundamentally different in how they go about things, but they're applied to different kinds of things. Common sense being applied to using things, enjoying things, while science is applied to those technical problems that are not directly about using or enjoying anything, right? When you're studying geology, when you're studying astronomy, you're not primarily concerned with how we can enjoy, deposits in this or that rock or the orbit of this or that celestial body. You're just trying to understand what it is, know more about it. And then when you get into how do we actually make use of this for something practical, how can we enhance human life with this, then you start dealing with common sense logic, common sense inquiry. Where were we? I think here it is not urged that attainment of a unified logic, a theory of inquiry, will resolve the split in our beliefs and procedures, but it is affirmed that it will not be resolved without it. So just unifying logic, as Dewey is attempting to do, is not going to solve all our problems, but our problems won't be solved without doing this. On the other hand, the problem of unification is one in and for logical theory itself. At the present time, logics in vogue, popular logics, do not claim for the most part to be logics of inquiry. In the main, we are asked to take our choice between the traditional logic, which was formulated not only long before the rise of science, but when also the content and methods of science were in radical opposition to those of present science. So that's one kind of logic, right? The traditional logic that was formulated before modern science, and even in a way that is opposed to modern science. That's one kind of logic. And then you have the new purely symbolistic logic that recognizes only mathematics, and even at that is not so much concerned with methods of mathematics as with linguistic formulation of its results. So then you have, on the other hand, this new symbolistic logic that I think arose in kind of the mid-19th century, maybe a little bit earlier. I forget exactly. Frege and people like that and his followers, Russell and so on. The development of a purely symbolistic logic based in mathematics. The logic of science is not only separated from common sense, but the best that can be done is to speak of logic and scientific method as two different and independent matters, according to this other view, right? Logic, in being purified from all experiential taint, has become so formalistic that it applies only to itself. Right? So this is Dewey being critical of existing logics, which tend to be either traditional, kind of pre-scientific, or they're so formalistic that they don't really help us do anything outside of logic. Outside of logic itself. So, finishing up here, kind of previewing what we're going to deal with next. The next chapter deals explicitly with the traditional logic as derived from Aristotle, with a view to showing, 1, that of necessity the scientific conditions under which it was formulated are so different from those of existing knowledge that it has been transformed from what it originally was, a logic of knowledge, into a purely formal affair. Right, so Aristotelian logic was invented, created, generated under conditions that are so different from what we have today that it's become a purely formal affair. That to try to rely on it today, it becomes a purely formal thing that cannot really be applied. And 2, that there is a necessity for a logical theory based upon scientific conclusions and methods. And that's what Dewey is trying to do. Come up with a logical theory based upon scientific conclusions and methods. These are so unlike those of classic science that the need is not revision and extension of the old logic here and there, but a radically different standpoint and a different treatment to be carried through all logical subject matter. So we're not going to be trying to revise Aristotelian logic. We're going to try to take science as we find it and figure out its logic, kind of take the best science that we have, figure out the logic that makes it actually work well, and go from there. All right, and I think we can conclude here, Chapter 4. And next time, go on to Chapter 5, which, as you can see, is the needed reform of logic. So, that's all for now. See ya.